Does this seem high? Is it likely to go lower on appeal? Because Trump says he will be appealing this.
You know, it's really hard to tell because the question of punitive damages is so discretionary, and it certainly is in the realm of possibilities that the appellate court would cut that down on some level. I think there isn't, a strong argument for appeal, but it is such a discretionary thing that it's really hard to know.
Just looking at the statement that we saw quickly on Truth Social and through now other means from Donald Trump, he refers to this, Rebecca, as a Biden-directed witch hunt focused on me and the Republican Party. What role did Joe Biden play in this?
Joe Biden played absolutely no role. There's no evidence that he played a role. There's no way in which he could play a role. This is not run by the Department of Justice. This is a civil lawsuit brought by a private party. He doesn't control the courts, just as Donald Trump didn't control the courts when he was president. So that statement is absolutely false.
Well, of course, this was a civil case, but there are also many criminal cases that the president is staring down, as he's been indicted on 91 felony counts. One of them here in Washington is, as of right now, slated to begin March 4th in pretty short order from here. How much do you think we could see all of these legal fights drug out? How many of them could actually happen before the election?
Yeah, I think the key word here right now is delay. His tactic is delay. It has been working. We're waiting right now for a decision on the appeal about questions of the former president's immunity in that case. And that will be appealed once again to the Supreme Court. This could all be resolved fairly quickly, but again, some of this is up to the courts, and there is a ticking clock.
Yeah, the Supreme Court maybe not even just having to weigh in on the idea of immunity, but also on February 8th going to be hearing arguments in the 14th Amendment case after Colorado kicked him off the ballot on those grounds. Just on these questions and on the Supreme Court, do you foresee any scenario in which they would be ruling against the former president? We always keep in mind here that 3 of these justices were appointed by him.
Yeah, I really think that the fact that there were 3 justices who were appointed by him is irrelevant. Obviously, it's not totally irrelevant in that the way that, different justices look at the law is in part comes from their background and their beliefs. But I don't think that they would in any way be indebted to the former president simply because he nominated them. And so, I don't think that's going to play a huge role. But I also don't see the Supreme Court in its current makeup as deciding the substantive issues that would actually allow states to kick him off the ballot. My guess, and this is purely speculation, is that they will find a way to decide this case on a more procedural ground, a kind of off-ramp that makes it such that he remains on the ballot, but they haven't decided whether or not he's engaged in insurrection, whether or not a president counts as an officer under the 14th Amendment, which is another critical question in that appeal.
Well, I guess it was a pretty bizarre day in court today, Rebecca. Donald Trump stormed out at one point, and his attorney, Alina Habba, was threatened with prison for her behavior. Do you see turnover coming in the legal team as he endeavors to navigate these next trials?
It's possible. He's always running that line where, he thinks he knows what's best for him, and he wants an attorney who's going to do exactly what he wants. But sometimes that doesn't work out exactly as planned. I think that storming out of the courtroom really did him a disservice because, of course, what the court the jury was deciding in part was what will it take in order to make him respect and abide by a jury verdict? And then by storming out, it makes him look like he has no respect for the jury. And so that was really a bad move, I think, on his part, not strategic. And again, lawyers who would be serious lawyers would push back and make sure he didn't do anything like that. But, there's also his personality. He doesn't like people pushing back, and he probably thinks that he has better judgment on these issues.
Something else we wanted to ask you about, Rebecca, is what's happening in Georgia, where, of course, the district attorney, Fani Willis, in Fulton County has brought charges against him and a multitude of other defendants. But it seems like we're running into a little bit of a snag here. Donald Trump joining a bid to disqualify her from pursuing that case because of claims she had an affair with the lead prosecutor. How badly could this get derailed by these accusations?
You know, I think it casts a shadow over the prosecution. It's essentially favoritism. It's like, you know, picking your brother or picking your best friend or your lover to have a plum job is not a good thing in government. And it's bad for public officials to do that. And it makes her look bad. And the public is right to question her judgment. That said, I think the disqualification motion here should fail because none of those bad decisions affect the prosecution, the quality of the prosecution, the accuracy of prosecution. Because her affair is with another prosecutor, there's no way in which that would affect the underlying charges. So I don't think disqualification is the right consequence for a public official engaging in this kind of conduct, but it is bad.
She was accused as well of acting in racist fashion, according to the complaint here. I don't even understand what that means on a legal basis, Rebecca. Will that be considered as part of this?
You know, I think if he had facts to prove that she was racist, then that could go to prosecutorial misconduct. But I think there's very little evidence that, there's no evidence that she has acted in any way out of racial animus here. It's just one of those refrains that the former president likes to use in order to undermine somebody who has acted in a way that's against his interest. And so, you know, I don't think that there's any legal merit or factual merit to that claim. If there were, it would be a legitimate claim, but it just likely is rhetoric.
Yeah.
And of course, there's already a number of defendants in this case who have reached plea deals. And I just wonder how, if there were to be an issue with Willis getting disqualified or something, what happens to everything that already has been agreed? Does everything get thrown out, hypothetically?
They could move to withdraw their pleas. Theoretically, it's an extremely high hurdle to do. So my guess is not. But again, I really don't think that these motions are going to go anywhere because it's not a conflict of interest. It is, petty corruption, favoritism, nepotism. None of those things are good things, but they are not a conflict of interest that affects the underlying case. So I can't see those disqualification motions going anywhere. And therefore, I think sort of a theoretical question about what would happen with those other plea deals.